The first thing anyone noticed about the Whitfield place that autumn was that the porch step had stopped creaking, and the second thing was that nobody could say when it had happened or who had done it. And Ada Whitfield stood on that step most mornings, turning the mystery over in her mind the way she once turned over a broken harness buckle, looking for the seam where the break had been. Everyone in the valley believed the ranch was dying, and for 2 years they had not been wrong. Her father was 11 months in the ground, the note at the bank was 3 payments behind, and the roof over the tack room had a hole in it wide enough to drop a lantern through, which was precisely what had almost happened the week before he died, when Thomas Whitfield had climbed up in the dark to patch it himself and come down with a fever that never left him. Ada had inherited 1,100 acres of good grass, 400 head of cattle that had thinned to 290 through a hard winter and a harder spring, 1 hired man too old to do more than sit the porch and mind the dog, and a debt that sat on her chest most nights like a stone laid there on purpose. She had also inherited, though she did not think of it this way, a habit her father had kept since she was a girl, which was to leave the lantern burning on a hook by the door until the last hand came in from the range. A small, stubborn light meant to say the house was still occupied, still waiting, still worth coming home to. She kept the lantern lit long after there was any hand left to wait for. It was, she told herself, simply a thing she did, the way some people said grace before food they had not prayed over in years. If you have ever kept a small habit alive long after the reason for it was gone, you already understand more about Ada Whitfield than most of the men in town ever managed to. And if that kind of quiet devotion is a thing you recognize, I would ask you to stay with this story to its end, because it earns what it gives you slowly, the way most true things do. She had let the last hired hand go in the spring, unable to pay him, and had been working the herd near alone with old Silas Pruitt from the next section, riding over twice a week out of neighborliness more than obligation, when a man came walking up the north road on foot, leading no horse, carrying a canvas roll and a coil of rope and nothing else that she could see, and asked if she had work for a man willing to earn his keep before he earned his wages. He gave his name as Jonah Cade, and he did not offer more than that. And Ada had learned enough in a hard year to know that a man who does not explain himself is not always a man with something to hide. Sometimes he is only a man with nothing left to say. He was perhaps 30, weathered past his years the way men get who have worked outdoors since boyhood, with a scar along one forearm he did not draw attention to, and hands that moved over a length of fence wire like he was greeting an old friend rather than assessing a stranger's tool. She told him she could offer a bunk in the barn, meals and wages she was ashamed to name, and he said that would do, and that was the whole of the negotiation. Silas Pruitt, riding over 2 days later and finding a stranger mending the corral gate with an economy of motion that wasted nothing, sat his horse a long while before he said anything at all. And what he finally said was, "That man ties a knot like he's done it in his sleep," which from Silas was as close to admiration as the weather allowed. Ada watched Jonah Cade work through that first week the way a person watches a fire they are not yet sure has caught. And what she noticed was not any single remarkable thing, but an accumulation of small ones. The way he never asked twice where a tool belonged. The way he read the cattle's movement before they moved. The way he ate what was put in front of him without complaint and without excess, and thanked her for it plainly. The same 3 words each time, spoken like a debt being paid, rather than a courtesy being extended. What she did not know, because he did not offer it, and she did not ask, was that Jonah Cade had walked that north road once before, 17 years earlier, as a boy of 13 with no father living, and a mother too sick to keep him, and that it had been Thomas Whitfield who found him sleeping in the loft of an empty line shack that winter and did not turn him out, who fed him and taught him to sit a horse properly and read a brand and mend a fence so it would hold through a hard freeze, who kept him 2 years before the boy's uncle sent for him to come work a claim out west, a claim that turned out, against every reasonable expectation, to hold silver enough to make a modest fortune of a boy who had once owned nothing but the clothes on his back. Jonah Cade had written to Thomas Whitfield exactly once in the years since, a short letter promising to come back and settle what he owed, and then life and distance, and a young man's belief that there would always be more time had done what they do. And the letter had gone unanswered, not from Thomas's silence but from Jonah's own delay, until word finally reached him, months late, that Thomas Whitfield was dead and had left behind a daughter fighting alone to keep a ranch that was slowly going under. He had come back, meaning to make it right in the plainest way he knew, which was money quietly given, but somewhere on that north road, watching Ada Whitfield stand on her father's porch with her sleeves rolled and her jaw set against a debt she had not made, he had decided he did not want to hand her money and a name, and watch her face change the way faces change when gratitude replaces the possibility of anything else. He wanted, for reasons he did not examine too closely, to be simply a man who worked for her, and be known, if he was to be known at all, for what his hands did, rather than for what his bank account could do. So he worked her cattle by day, and did not tell her that the note at the bank, 3 payments behind, had already been quietly settled in full by a lawyer's letter from the territorial capital that listed no name she would have recognized, and did not tell her that the hole in the tackroom roof had been patched not by wind or luck, but by his own hands in the dark hours after the house had gone to sleep, working by lantern light because daylight belonged to the herd, and the only hours left to him belonged to the house that had once, briefly, been the closest thing to a home he had ever known. The porch steps stopped creaking the same week the bank sent a letter, unusually gentle in tone, saying only that her account showed no arrears, and Ada read that letter 3 times standing in the kitchen doorway, and then walked out and stood on the step and pressed her weight down on the board that had complained under every foot for 6 years, and felt nothing but solid wood answering her, quiet as a held breath. She did not think of Jonah Cade at first, because there was no reason to, because a hired hand paid in the coin of poor wages and a bunk in the barn was not the kind of man who paid off another family's debt, and because the bank's letter mentioned an attorney and a sum transferred from an account in a city she had never seen, and those were not the tools of a man who owned 2 shirts and a canvas roll. She thanked God, quietly and without ceremony, the way her father had taught her to be grateful for things too large to understand, and she went on working. And the strange, small repairs went on happening. A hinge oiled, a fence brace doubled, a window frame reset so it no longer let in the draft that had made her father cough through his last winter. And each time she noticed one, she felt the same puzzled gratitude, and told herself it was likely Silas, or some debt of her father's being quietly repaid by a man too proud to say so. And she did not look harder than that, because looking harder was a thing she had not yet learned to do, without also finding out how much she had come to depend, without meaning to, on a man who slept in her barn and said 3 words of thanks over every plate of food she gave him. It was Silas Pruitt, of all people, who first put a small crack in her certainty, riding over one gray afternoon with his hat pulled low against a wind that smelled of coming snow, watching Jonah split cordwood near the barn with the same economy he brought to everything, and saying, not quite to Ada, not quite to himself, "Man works like he's got something to prove, or something to pay back. Never seen the two look so much alike before." Ada had laughed it off, but the laugh did not sit easy, because she had begun, without admitting it fully, to notice the way Jonah's face changed at the mention of her father's name, a stillness that came over him like a man bracing against cold, and the way he knew things about the ranch's history he ought not to have known. The location of a spring her father had dug out 15 years back and told almost no one about, the particular way her father had liked his coffee, bitter and black, which Jonah made without being told, the second morning he was there, as though the knowledge had simply always been in him. She began to watch him the way she had once watched the fire, no longer wondering if it would catch, but wondering, with a feeling she did not yet have a name for, what exactly was burning in there and how long it had been burning before she noticed the light. Trust between them built the way most true trust does, in small, unremarkable increments that neither of them marked as significant at the time. It was in the way she began leaving his coffee cup filled before he asked, and the way he began mending things she had not yet told him were broken, as if he moved through the house at night cataloging its wounds the way a doctor moves through a ward. It was in the evenings when the work was done and the light was failing, and she would sit on the mended porch step with the ledger book open on her knee, adding figures that no longer frightened her quite so much, and he would sit a respectful distance away cleaning a bridle or working a knot from a rope, and neither of them spoke for long stretches, and the silence between them had none of the strain. Silence usually carries between strangers, but something closer to the quiet of two people who had already said, without words, the things that mattered. She asked him once, not quite looking at him, where he had learned to fix a hinge so it never squeaked again, and he said only, "A man taught me once, long time ago," and did not offer the man's name, and she did not ask for it, though something in her chest had gone very still when he said it, the way a person goes still when they hear a familiar tune played in an unfamiliar room and cannot yet place where they know it from. The letters were the first hard clue, though she did not read them, only saw them, 3 of them across as many months, arriving by the same rider who brought the mail from town, addressed not to Jonah Cade, but to a name she did not recognize, a name that made the postal rider frown slightly and ask if he had the right ranch, and Jonah taking the letter without explanation and folding it into his shirt pocket, unread in front of her, to be read, she supposed, alone in the barn where his other secrets apparently lived. She noticed, too, that he never spent his wages, meager as they were, on anything beyond the barest necessity. A new pair of boot soles. Tobacco he did not seem to actually smoke, and once, strangely, a small tin of peppermint drops that she found later left on the kitchen table with no note, which she ate slowly over the course of a week and did not mention to him, though she watched his face carefully the evening after they were gone, and thought she saw something like satisfaction pass over it, quickly hidden. The bank's silence over the paid note, which she had accepted gratefully, and without deep inquiry through the long months of that autumn, finally broke on a cold morning in early winter, when Harmon Voss himself rode out to the ranch, a man Ada had known her whole life as the sort who smiled with his mouth and calculated with his eyes, and who had made no secret, in the 2 years since her father died, of believing that a woman alone could not hold a ranch and ought to sell it, preferably to him, at a price that reflected her desperation rather than the land's worth. He sat his horse at the edge of the yard and did not dismount, which she understood immediately as a kind of insult, a man too important to walk on ground he did not yet own, and he told her without preamble that the bank's directors had grown curious about the source of the payment that had cleared her note, since the transfer had come through a territorial attorney with instructions that named no obliger, and that such arrangements, in his experience, usually meant one of 2 things, either theft being laundered clean, or a debt of a very different nature being quietly repaid. And he wondered, looking past her toward the barn where Jonah Cade was working a green colt in the round pen, whether she knew the true character of the man she had taken into her house. Ada felt something cold settle into her stomach that had nothing to do with the wind, not because she believed Harmon Voss, whom she had never once believed about anything, but because his words had simply confirmed what some quieter part of her had been circling for weeks without landing. She told him, evenly, that her note was paid, and none of it was his business how, and he smiled his mouth smile and said that he had taken the liberty of writing to the same attorney, and that the reply, which he happened to have with him, might interest her more than it interested the bank, and he held out a folded paper, not quite offering it, making her cross the yard to take it from his hand, which she did, because pride is a poor substitute for information when a person's whole life is balanced on a debt they no longer understood. The letter was brief and dry in the manner of legal correspondence, and it named, without ceremony, the true identity of the man she had known for 4 months as a poor hired hand sleeping in her barn for wages she was ashamed to name. Jonah Cade, it said, was properly Jonah Whitcomb, sole heir to a silver claim in the Western Territories that had made him, by the attorney's careful phrasing, a man of considerable and increasing means, and the payment on the Whitfield note had been made at his express instruction, along with a standing arrangement to cover the ranch's debts as they arose, an arrangement he had asked, twice, to be kept entirely confidential from the party benefiting from it. Ada read the letter twice, standing in the cold with Harmon Voss watching her face for the reaction he had clearly ridden out, hoping to witness. And what she felt first was not the anger she might have expected, but something closer to a floor giving way beneath a room she had thought was solid ground. The particular vertigo of discovering that a kindness she had believed came from providence, or luck, or a debt of her father's quietly repaid by a stranger's conscience, had in fact come from a man who ate at her table every evening and thanked her in 3 words she had come to listen for. A man who had watched her worry over figures in a ledger he could have made irrelevant with a single sentence, and had said nothing. She did not give Harmon Voss the satisfaction of a visible collapse, thanked him with a coldness that matched his own, and watched him ride away disappointed. And then she walked to the round pen, where Jonah Whitcomb, who she still could not quite call by that name in her own mind, was working the colt with the same patient hands he had used on every broken thing on that ranch. And she stood at the rail until he noticed her, and something in her face must have told him everything, because he set down the lead rope slowly, the way a man sets down a thing he suspects he will not be picking back up. "You could have told me," she said, and her voice came out flatter than she meant it to, more exhausted than angry, though the anger was there too, banked low like a coal. "I know," he said. "That's all, you know." "I was afraid," he said, "of exactly this, of you looking at me the way you're looking at me now. How am I looking at you? Like I've been lying to you every day I've been here." She did not answer that directly, because it was true, and because the ledger of it was more complicated than a single lie. It was months of small silences stacked one on another until they had built something that looked, from where she stood, uncomfortably like the very deception he claimed to have feared. She asked him, then, why. If he had money enough to save the ranch outright and be done with it, he had chosen instead to sleep in her barn and mend her fences with his own hands in the dark. And he told her, finally, the part of the story he had kept folded away with the letters he never let her see, about a hungry boy in a line shack, and a man named Thomas Whitfield who had not asked what the boy could pay before feeding him, and a promise made, and not kept in time, and a guilt that had ridden with him for 17 years until it delivered him, at last, to her porch step with nothing to offer but work and a name he was afraid to give her, because he feared, not without reason, that once she knew what he could give her, she would never again believe that what he wanted, more than anything, was simply to be near her, working, useful, unremarkable, chosen for himself and not for what sat in a bank account 3 territories away. It was not an excuse she was ready to accept that evening, and she told him so plainly, and he did not argue, only nodded once, the way a man nods when a verdict he expected is finally read aloud, and he did not sleep in the barn that night, though she did not know it until morning, when she found his bunk stripped bare and his canvas roll gone, and, on the kitchen table where the tin of peppermint drops had once sat without explanation, a single folded page in the attorney's careful hand, the original letter naming him, with a line struck through the standing arrangement and a new note beneath it in Jonah's own plainer hand, stating that the ranch was hers free and clear, regardless of anything that passed between them from that day forward, and that he was sorry, and that he would not trouble her further. Ada stood in the kitchen with that page in her hand for a long while, and what she felt was not relief at the debt's final erasure, which she might once have thought was all she wanted from the world, but something far more urgent and far less comfortable, a fear that had nothing to do with money at all. And she walked out onto the porch step, solid now under her boots where it had once complained, and she looked north along the road he must have taken, and she thought of every small repair she had puzzled over for months, the hinge, the window frame, the roof, and understood, finally and completely, that every one of them had been a sentence in a language he had not trusted himself to speak plainly, and that she had been, without knowing it, reading a confession for months in the grain of her own house's mended wood. She saddled a horse before the sun was fully up, ignoring old Silas's startled question from the yard, and rode the north road at a pace that frightened the horse more than it frightened her. And she found Jonah Whitcomb a little over 3 miles out, walking on foot as he had walked in, canvas roll over his shoulder, moving with the same economy he brought to everything, as though leaving too could be done efficiently, without waste. She pulled the horse up hard enough that it half reared, and he turned, and neither of them said anything for a moment that felt considerably longer than it was. "You fixed the step first," she said finally, because it was the thing sitting closest to the surface, though it was not on its face, an answer to anything. Before the roof, before the fences, the step first. "It was the first thing," he said, "that I remembered being broken, because it was the last thing my father tried to fix before he died." He did not answer that, because there was nothing in it that needed answering, and she understood, looking at him standing in the cold morning light with everything he owned slung over one shoulder, that he had not fixed her step to erase a debt or purchase forgiveness. He had fixed it because some old grief in him could not let a broken thing that Thomas Whitfield had touched stay broken, and that the money he had spent so quietly on her behalf was, in its own strange arithmetic, worth less to him than the hours he had spent with a hammer in the dark, doing work that cost him nothing but sleep and asked nothing in return but the privilege of being near a family that had once, briefly, saved him. "I don't need a rich man," she said, and her voice was steadier now, finding its ground the way the step had finally found its own. "I never asked for one, and I don't want one. What I need is a man who fixes what's broken and stays long enough to see whether it holds." She held out her hand, not for him to take exactly, but simply held it out, the way a person holds out a hand to something wary and half-wild, patient, unhurried, willing to wait as long as it took. "Come back and finish the roof," she said. "You left it half done." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face that had been braced for months finally let go, the way a fence post gives when the strain that held it rigid is finally released, and he walked back toward the horse, toward her, toward the ranch that sat waiting under a gray winter sky with its lantern still hanging cold and unlit on its hook by the door, waiting for evening the way it always had. He finished the roof before the first real snow came, and stayed on through that winter and the ones that followed, no longer as a hired hand paid in shame wages, but as something the valley took its time naming properly, though nobody who watched them work the herd together that first spring, moving with the same unhurried economy, needed the name explained to them twice. Harmon Voss made one more visit that winter, offering a price for the ranch that insulted them both, and left with considerably less confidence than he arrived with. Once Jonah mentioned mildly that the note was paid in full and had been for some time, and that the bank might find its own books more interesting reading than hers. Silas Pruitt, riding over one spring evening to find the two of them sitting together on the porch step. The lantern lit above them, though the last hand was long since in, allowed himself the closest thing to a smile the valley had seen on him in years, and said only, "Steps holding up fine," and rode on before either of them could answer, which was, everyone agreed later, about as much sentiment as Silas Pruitt had in him. Years afterward, when the ranch house had grown a new wing to hold a family that had not existed, the winter Jonah Whitcomb walked up the north road with nothing but a canvas roll and a debt he could not stop trying to repay. The porch step remained exactly as he had mended it that first autumn, worn smooth now by the passage of boots crossing it morning and evening without a single complaint from the wood, and the lantern still hung on its hook by the door, lit each night not because anyone was still out on the range and needed guiding home, but because Ada Whitcomb had never quite been able to break the habit her father started, and because her husband, passing beneath it each evening, still paused for half a second every single time, as though some part of him could not quite believe he had been allowed, at last, to come home to a light that was burning for him and no one else.